This is Tell Your Story Alaska. We talk aviation, history, theology, but most of all, the raw stories of Alaskans and the gospel. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Tell Your Story Alaska. Today I'm very excited to hear the story of my friend Brian Porterfield. Now, I met Brian because we were both flying for the same camp, Cochrane Hills Bible Camp. He's got quite a history of aviation in his life, and we want to dive into some of that history of aviation, his flying stories, flying in different parts of the world, flying many different aircraft, and flying some really unique techniques that you might not learn in the CFI books. So we're going to dive into that and get some wisdom from an experienced aviator and have a little fun. So Brian, thanks for coming on the podcast.
You're welcome.
So let's start with your backstory. Tell us about where you were born, where you grew up, who your parents are. Let's start with that. Tell us those things.
Well, it all started a long time ago.
How long ago now?
Well, my parents were in missionary training and with New Tribes Mission, and I was born in Chicago, Illinois. And then in 1949, my parents went to Bolivia after not being able to get to China because that closed down. So we went down on a DC-3, and that was a roundabout trip because there was a revolution going on in Bolivia. And in fact, when we finally landed at our destination in Cochabamba at the time, when they opened up the aircraft door, soldiers got on pointing guns at us.
Do you remember this? You were a young child?
And I remember sitting on the left side of the airplane and looking to my right where they came in the door. And then years later, I always wondered, why did I look right? Because I always see the door on the left side of the airplane. But that particular DC-3, and there was a few of them that had the door on the right, so I was right. So anyway, then we got a ride into town with the military, and there's more to that story. But anyway, that infected me with the flying bug when I was still 3 years old.
And you remember being 3 years old. That's impressive.
Oh, sure.
Wow.
In fact, I was, of course, impressed with the pilots. And when we were there, they must have stayed down there for a bit of a time. And it was Thanksgiving coming up. And I wanted to see them chop the head off the turkey. And so they said, well, if I was a good boy, I could watch. Well, I don't know what I did, but they didn't let me watch. So.
You're not a good boy?
Yeah, I guess not.
Okay, so give us an idea of what is it like to grow up as a missionary kid in Bolivia? Like, what did your parents do? What were they trying to do? And what was that experience like for you? Did you have a good experience, a negative one?
Oh, I think it was great in some respects. So my parents' job was contacting wild Indians, basically, uncontacted tribes, whose first instinct is to shoot you and talk later.
Wow.
In fact, in 1951, my dad's buddy was killed. But anyway, that's what he was involved with. And our base, where we lived, was a little town about 2 weeks up the Guapore River, a riverboat that was very slow, like an 8 horsepower thing. And, it was just... it's one of those old motors that just go boom, 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 boom. Anyway, take about 2 weeks going up in the dry season when the water was shallow, and about a week coming down to get to town. So we were up there quite a ways, and then from there, then he and the other fellows would hike, basically. They'd go upriver in a canoe some more and then hike in and try to find these Indians. So that's what they did at first, and my mom was going to homeschool me, and I remember getting all these cool supplies and whatnot, and so I'd be sitting there trying to be a first grader, and my Bolivian buddies had come by, and one of them said, hey, our dad's got an alligator upriver, let's go. Boom, I was out the door, and I'd be gone all day. I didn't ask permission or anything. And then I got home, and I got such a licking. And the next big adventure that came up, I was out the door and away we went. So Mom thought she was saving my life to send me off to first grade when I was 6 years old. So
And what do you mean by sending off?
I had to go across the country to a boarding school.
Okay.
In fact, when I went back the second time, I was still, no, I was 5 when I went to, I think. I started first grade, and the second trip out, I was 6 and went by myself cross country on a DC-3 until we got to the city where the school was. And I presume somebody met me there, obviously. But anyway, I was basically traveling by myself.
Wow.
Across the country. And
was that, I mean, you're like in first grade. Was that kind of scary in some other
6.
country?
Oh, no, it was an adventure to me. And I remember that, I think it was our first stop, we because the DC-3 made a number of stops going there. Mm-hmm. And this is all in the lowlands, and Cochabamba's up high, 8,500 feet.
Wow.
There's more of that story later, but I remember the first stop, this guy befriended me and gave me candy bars and stuff. And so we got out and looked around, and here was a B-17 that had collapsed the gear or something and was sitting up on barrels. So I remember that. I was impressed with that.
Yeah, that was really cool. So a B-17, would have been service in World War II?
Well, they got surplus B-17s, B-24s, and they used them for hauling freight and mostly hauling meat. So in the lowlands, there was a lot of grassland and whatnot, and so these ranches would raise beef, and then the meat plane would come in, and they'd haul like 40 head or whatever it was of meat up to the cities.
Huh.
And that's what the meat supply was.
And that's what they use those for?
Yeah.
Okay. So tell me, did you have a good boarding school experience, or was that negative?
No, it was good. I didn't like being away, and it felt like I missed out on a lot of adventure being with my dad and all that. But it was a good experience. There was good people there, people I still admire. So
yeah,
and I didn't like to study and all that. So I was more out, for having fun as a kid than studying. So
now, that was
a necessary evil.
Yes. Now, as you were kind of growing up, did you get a chance to fly in small, like missionary planes in those days, or was it mostly just boating to these villages?
No, got to fly some. Remember, I think it was the first flight was Howard, and I was 8 or 9, something like that. So 2 other little guys and I were going to fly out to our parents' place because there was an airstrip upriver from us a little ways. And so I remember we're sitting in the airplane taking off. We're on our takeoff roll, and that's when the airport in Santa Cruz was just still a grass strip instead of a huge international airport. But so anyway, on our takeoff roll, a Jeep came running out and stopped us. And here there was a revolution going on, which typically occurred on an average of every 9 months during that period of time.
A new revolution every 9 months?
Yeah.
Oh, gosh, that's chaotic.
Yeah, so anyway, so they stopped all the flying, and we were stuck with that pilot and his poor wife for a whole month, us little kids.
Wow.
3 little boys. Anyway, and then my parents, there's no radio contact, nothing. They arranged ahead of time for the flight. And here, day after day, week after week, it didn't show up. So they probably assumed the worst, that it had gone down in the jungle someplace. But anyway, we finally made it.
Yeah.
So that was my first flight that I remember. And then after that, they had a Stinson there. And so I got a ride in that once or twice. And that was Mel Wyma, who was like Uncle Mel. I grew up with his kids, And they actually let me, or he actually let me take the controls at that point. So that was a huge high point in my little life at the time. So.
Yes. I see the same face on, if I'm ever flying someone, I let him take the control. Even if it's a middle-aged man, he becomes very childlike,
Yeah.
We all of us men still want to be like children, have that that excitement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I always wanted to be a pilot. Now, I wavered slightly when I was 6. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a pilot or a fireman. But that went away pretty quick. So that's my
Quickly
life.
became a pilot. Yeah. So since 6 years old, basically, even since you were 3, it's all been aviation.
Yeah.
And it's got to be nice to have that kind of clarity, because I feel like young people today, they're like, I don't know what I want to do with my life.
No, I grew up, I always wanted to be a missionary pilot.
Yeah.
I didn't have aspirations for airlines or anything like that. It did happen later, but that was my goal. So
Okay.
very early on.
Walk us through a little bit. How did you go from Bolivia to becoming your own missionary pilot?
Well, when we were on furlough, when I was 16, I was able to take some flight lessons. I almost soloed, but I got an infection in my nose, and that took my solo money. So went back to Bolivia and finished high school, and then I stayed down there for a year after that, and then came back to Bible school, and then I think the first summer in Bible school, and I started resumed my flight lessons, and then got my private license in about.
Which Bible school did you go to?
New Tribes Bible Institute in Waukesha, Wisconsin.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
And it's still in existence.
Yeah.
And so then built up time and just hopping rides, half-hour rides at a time. I'd round up 3 people. It would pay $2.50 each to pay for a half an hour in a $15 an hour airplane.
Wow.
And
those numbers are so
slowly
different.
built up time.
It's weird hearing those numbers, knowing what it costs today.
Oh, yeah, that's something else.
Yes.
Well, hearing about cost, fast forward to the Philippines when I was there, the flight program was set up so that it was like a flight club. The people that use the airplane regularly paid $10 a month and then $6 an hour for their flights.
Wow.
Can you believe that?
No, I have a hard time believing that, knowing what we pay now.
Even back then, it was way cheap.
Yeah.
So basically, we charged for the basic operation of the airplane. We didn't set aside for overhaul or replacing the airplane, and just trusted the Lord to bring in the money for that, and He always did.
Yeah.
So that's how we worked at the time.
Okay. So tell us about, you joined New Tribes then, became a pilot for them.
Yeah, I was just finishing up language school, which was at the time in the same building as the Bible school. And the very next year it moved down to Missouri, I think it was. Yeah. So anyway, I was getting ready to go to A&P school because that was a requirement that we have an A&P license as well as a pilot license to serve. But the missionary from the Philippines came back on furlough and needed a pilot. So he asked if I'd be willing to go over there. And I always wanted to go back to Bolivia, but I just felt, well, I don't know what direction the Lord wants me to go, so I'll just head for Bolivia until He tells me otherwise. Well, when Lee Gurman asked me to go to the Philippines, I just took that as the leading of the Lord that's what I should do. So we went. We had $50 promise support when we left, which was 10 times what my parents had in 1949.
Wow.
But the Lord always met our needs.
Wow. $50 a month.
Promise, and I don't know if that even came in.
Yeah, you don't even.
Every month was different, and it was never a lot, but
I mean, I spend $50 on just swinging by the grocery store now to pick up little things.
Yeah, and, in a one light bag.
Yes. Exactly. My how things have changed.
Oh man.
Yes.
Well, I mean, the missionary that challenged me to go over there had been building a house which wasn't quite finished, and as I recall, I bought it from him for $800 and spent about $400 finishing it. A house, mind you.
Wow.
So.
Wow. Okay, so tell us, take us into the Philippines. What was flying there like? What type of aircraft did you fly? And what were the challenges of flying over there?
Well, the missionary work was with tribal people back in the mountains. And at that time, there were no roads where we went and no navigable rivers. So it was either hike in or fly in. We used a Super Cub or Super Cubs and a Mall when it was running, and that's another story. But we figured for every 6 minutes that we flew in the Super Cub, it saved a hard day's hike.
Wow.
And I know what those hikes are like because when we'd open up a new airstrip or wanted to open one, I'd hike in. I'd fly to an airstrip nearby and hike in and pick out a site. And then when they would finish the airstrip, I would always hike back in and inspect it before I'd land on it.
Yeah.
I didn't want any surprises.
So you had to do the hike twice usually before you flew there.
Yeah. So, I knew what people were going through. That And to have families in there, because our missionaries lived with the people. It wasn't just in and out and see them once in a while. They lived with them, learned the language,
right?
And translating God's word into their language. And anyway, for many of them, it was a lifelong project to get this done, and it just wouldn't have happened. Certainly not as quickly as it did, or maybe at all, without the airplane.
Wow.
It was a vital tool. You couldn't have had your families in there hiking in like that, trying to get your supplies, all of that. But the airplane just made it a breeze. I mean, our flights were short, 10, 15 minutes. Even figuring in the Manila flights, which were an hour and 20 minutes each way, the average flights were still just 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So the local flights were
but
close by.
That 15, 20-minute flight saved days and days of hiking.
Oh, man. And
through thick jungle and all that, and heat. And
yeah, mountainous. It was mountainous where we were. So, going through flat jungle is one thing, but climbing mountains on up and down and oh man, that takes it out of you.
Yeah. Now, when you mentioned they made the airstrip, would that be the folks in the villages?
Yeah.
They would do the work and make the airstrip. And why would they do that? Like, what was their motivation for getting an airstrip?
Typically, what we would do, I'll give an example of this one place.
Okay.
I'd hike in with the missionary that felt called to that particular tribe, along with the field director, hike in and talk to the people. Now, there was some of them knew the national language. Now, these tribes weren't as primitive as the ones my folks worked with in Bolivia. But
Okay.
so anyway, we'd go in there and tell them what we wanted to do, and get their approval and all that. And then I'd go along to pick out an airstrip site. And so we'd do that. This one place we went, we looked at all different places, and I picked out several. Another mission said it was impossible to find another place around there, but we did. And so we were sitting in the village talking to the people, and then they said, well, what about right here? And here was this ridge that we'd walked up and down coming into the village. But it was all covered with vegetation and trees and whatnot. And I didn't even consider it as a possibility for an airstrip. But I thought, well, let's take a look. So they cut a trail down through there, and sure enough, it was straight enough and long enough. And figured a dog leg at the end, which eventually didn't work anyway. But it was a narrow ridge, so they had to clear off the trees from it, and it was still narrow. So what they did is they used the trees that they cut off for like a retaining wall, dug down and cut the ridge down to make it wide enough, and then the dirt that they cut down they used for fill.
Yeah, interesting.
So half the airstrip was solid ground and the other half was fill.
Yeah.
So what I made them do is pack it. So we cut a stump and then put two handles on it. So whenever I told them, like every 4 inches when you fill in with fill, is tamp it down.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't have a bunch of settling.
Yep.
And that worked good.
Wow.
But it was also a 15% slope, which was very mild compared to what we usually had.
Yeah.
Or I had on some of the other ones. But with new dirt like that, I knew it would wash in the rain. So I had them like every 10 feet, cut just a little ditch going diagonally across the strip, so it'd catch a little water, run it off, catch a little, run it off, so it wouldn't end up with gullies down there.
Yeah, I've seen that trick before, yeah.
And that worked out well.
Yeah.
It took a long time for grass to grow on it because it was just bare ground that was cut down.
And were they motivated to do all this work because they wanted the airplane access?
This was the hardest airstrip I saw made while I was there, and they did it in the least amount of time.
Wow.
I flew over it, they started working on it. I was leaving for a vacation at the time. So I was gone for 2 weeks. When I came back, the airstrip was finished.
Wow.
And these guys had, I think, one wheelbarrow and one or two metal shovels.
Yeah, that's all they had.
That's all they had.
Did you provide those? Did you bring those?
I think, yeah, must have, or somebody had them. I don't remember how they had them.
Yeah.
But now, this was in the rice terrace area. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures in the Philippines of the rice terraces.
I think so.
But they just terraced up the side of a mountain to grow the rice because that type of rice had to be in water part of the time. So these guys knew how to move dirt.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just amazing. They had wooden shovels they had made, and since they didn't have a wheelbarrow, they had like a stretcher. So they'd pile a stretcher full of dirt, and two guys would carry it and dump it.
Wow.
Like a side dump, dump truck. So they moved that, and there was a huge rock in there they couldn't possibly move, so they just dug a big hole down beside it, dug under it, rolled the rock into it, and buried the sucker. Those guys knew what they were doing. So.
Yeah. Very clever, very ingenuitive. Yeah. Okay, so tell us about...
just back up a second.
Okay.
Now, this was back in the 70s, basically, that airstrip. I got there in 68. And some of the missionaries were basically just kind of getting started with the language and all of that back then. And now I'm thinking of two different tribes and maybe more that I'm not aware of. But the gospel has just really taken off after all these years. Like the Kalanguya I'm thinking of right now, Bob and Judy Ambrosius were getting started when I was there. And they, over the years, they translated the New Testament and other portions of the Scripture. And then finally, I think it was last year or just the year before, they finally got the whole completed Bible, along with commentary and all of that.
How many years did that take them from day one walking in the tribe to having a Bible?
Probably 50-ish years.
50 years in one tribe.
Yeah, he was coming up on 30 when I knew him, and he's now past 80.
Wow.
He's a little older than me.
Okay.
But there's 30-some churches and something like 6,000 believers back there in that one tribe. And this happened in another tribe that I know of, and I'm sure other ones too. Well, and then also the Ilongo tribe. But, to look back and the faithfulness of those missionaries over all those years, and now the people have got all of God's Word in their own language, and then some of them actually helped translate part of the Old Testament, as they were able to get education to do that. So it's just really, really cool to see that.
That is amazing, and it reminds me of Moses, who lived out so much of his life. Then he got right to the cusp of the promised land, and then he didn't get to go.
Yeah.
And these missionaries, they devote 50 years or whatever it was to these things.
Oh man.
And 50 years of just nothing, just the tedious translation work. And I've played a small hand in that kind of work, and I know how tedious and it can be so miserable. Why am I doing this and all of that?
I often say that I had the privilege of flying some of God's best saints. And boy, I'll tell you, those people that stuck with it all those years to get God's Word in that language, I just have nothing but admiration for them. That's really cool.
And you got to fly them in.
Yeah. Well, for a short period of time. I was there 4.5 years in the Philippines.
Oh, just 4.5. Okay. Okay. And so tell me, I think you had a couple of stories out of the Philippines from your time there as far as flying goes. Would you tell us
Bob Ambrosius that I just told you about, the translator, got a call one day that there was a young lady having trouble with giving birth. The water had broken 2 days before, and the baby wouldn't come. So they wanted an emergency flight, and the mall was operational at the time. So I flew in there, and that airstrip was something else too. So it was a one-way strip. It was in a canyon. Once you entered the canyon, you had to land. So I'd come across a ridge.
And as you were entering that canyon, I'm guessing you could not see the airstrip, but that was
you could.
Oh, you could. Okay.
So I'd come across a ridge, right? I'd do this exactly the same every time.
Okay.
So, and that's another thing that's important in some of these airstrips, especially one-way ones. I'd come across a ridge, and I'd fly down to a dead tree and then turn into the airstrip. The beginning of the airstrip was 19%, went to 21, then to 28% up to the top, and the top was just cut out of the side of the mountain. So you had to keep your speed up. So I'd touch down and add power, sometimes full power to get to the top. But you can't be going too fast because there's only room to just turn around.
Yeah.
But if you can't make it to the top, I'd sit there full blast with the Cub and wouldn't move. I'd have to have somebody jump out and push.
Wow.
So anyway, that was that airstrip. So I came in there and picked up the young lady and her husband. I mean, they looked like kids even back then. But that was their first baby. And then Bob came out, the missionary there, so he came out with us. So we flew into Baguio City, which was maybe 10 minutes from there, but it would have been probably more than 2 days hike, through those mountains and canyons and whatnot. So it was a big enough airport that they had commercial prop planes that could come in there. But it was an off time of the day, so there's only one old rickety taxi there. So we got into this thing. We're heading for a missionary clinic that we know of in town. Just started going down the hill there, and we're going by some construction, and I heard a noise in the back seat. Turned around, and here they're holding the baby.
Wow.
In their hands, and it was still in a sack.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
So it was like you're buying a chicken or something in the store, and it's in this.
It's still in the wrapping, yeah.
Yeah. And so we told the driver to pull over, and we had to get past these construction guys. Well, I didn't know what to do, and Bob knew even less. So he went around to the back seat and was holding this thing. I thought, well, rip the sack off. So I ripped the sack off, and there's slime all over this little thing, and it didn't move or breathing. It looked like it was dead. So I took my dirty hands and cleaned around his little face and his nose and the mouth, and I put him face down on Bob's hands, and I whopped it on the back, and cough, sputter, whoa, it's alive! And he choked up, and I turned him over and cleaned out around his mouth and nose again, and whopped him again, and he started crying, and that's the most beautiful sound in the world.
Yes.
Anyway, so we headed on down the road, and then climbing the hill on the other side, the taxi overheated. So now I think it was a regular occurrence because he did have buckets or pails. So we went looking up in the ditches for water, and finally found some, poured it in the radiator, and pushed the thing the rest of the way over the hill. And so we finally get to the doctor's office, and I paid the taxi driver handsomely for the mess in the back of the seat. And anyway, the doctor checked her over and said, well, you guys did good. Well, for one thing, here's hooked up to the cord. Well, I always hear you got to cut the cord. Well, I didn't even have a knife or anything. So well, if we tied it off, that ought to be good enough, right? Mm-hmm. No string, nothing. So I took my hanky and ripped off the seam on two sides of it, tied the cord with it, and away we went. So anyway, that worked. So we went to town, did some shopping, and came back. Thought, well, let's check on them, see how they're doing. She's sitting up, wanting to go home.
Wow.
So the doctor, and this is her first child, too. And the doctor said, yeah, that'd be fine. She's okay. Mm-hmm. So we had a better taxi this time. And so we're heading back, and I couldn't help but look in the back. These two, they seem like kids, their first little baby. And with the biggest smiles on their faces. It's so cute.
Yeah, beautiful.
So they ended up naming it after me.
Oh, really?
But the only way they could pronounce my name instead of Brian is Be-Lion. So there's a 50-some-year-old Be-Lion out in the mountains there still.
Little does he know in English it means to lie, Be-Lion.
Yeah, right. Hi, Be-Lion.
Oh, I love that story.
Yeah. Okay. That was a nice one. There was a sad one. Got another call. It was on a Sunday. I only flew if it was emergencies. Went in and got another gal that they'd carried, I think, 4 days, and because the baby wouldn't come. So I picked her up, and her dad, I think it was, flew her in and got her into the clinic. And no more we got there, stood there and watched her die. That was sad. I didn't know their language or anything. I was standing there with her dad, and I couldn't even say anything to him. Yeah. So I just put my arm around him, and I don't know if that was culturally correct, but then within a couple hours, we had her back to the village and her body.
I have another episode where I tell a similar story, a time in Mexico. I feel like this is a common story among missionaries to experience that sort of thing. But it's kind of like they've just chosen to take the risk of experiencing those things by going. And they're willing to do it. And they're willing to put in those tedious years of language. They're willing to go through it because they know this life isn't all that there is.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Moses coming right up to the end there and not being able to go in.
Yeah.
Bob and Judy were going to go over there when the complete Bible was delivered and, have a celebration and all of that. And they couldn't go because of COVID.
Oh my, that was so devastating. Have they been able to go since, or no?
I'm not sure. I think so, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
But he still is in contact with him. I don't know what all he does, but he's their go-to guy, you know.
Yeah.
So.
Well, unless you have more Philippine stories, I know that you also served for a long time in Bolivia.
Oh, I got one more in the Philippines, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So I'd taken off of this airstrip. The last flight of the day is about 3:30. And I was hot and tired and just climbing out. I'd taken off, turned left, going up this canyon to climb out, heading toward home. And the engine started sputtering real bad. So I picked up the mic, told my wife to stand by, is having engine failure. And the engine quit. Well, I reached over and pulled out the mixture and got the engine going again. So, whoa. And I thought, why did I do that? Why didn't I check the mags? Why didn't I check the fuel? And then I realized that I already had. It just happened so fast that I thought that was the first thing I'd done. So anyway, I climbed up and got quite a bit of altitude, and I started messing with it, push in the mixture, and the thing had quit.
Huh.
And,
Seems odd.
So I had to have the mixture way out to make it run. Huh. So anyway, I got home assuming there's carburetor trouble and this and that, and so trying to figure out what was going on or running it, and then I noticed there was some flakes of something coming out the exhaust. So I took a look up inside there, and here the baffle had broken loose from the muffler and was partially plugging the exhaust.
Wow.
So what had happened is it's cutting off the air flowing through the engine to make it run, but it's not cutting off the fuel. So it's actually like choking it to death.
Yeah.
So I cut the fuel way back to match the amount of air now. Now it ran.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
So that might be something to think about if you're getting carburetor ice or something too, and if it gets real bad, is to lean it out.
Yeah.
And I think
to consider inspecting the exhaust when you do get back as the culprit.
I always cut the baffle out.
Just cut it out.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think some of the new ones that are made don't have it or something. And then some of them have like a bail up inside that blocks it. But
okay.
Anyway.
Yeah,
I don't trust it anymore.
You don't trust me. You were telling me earlier that you've been wanting to write an article about that because it seems like a big deal that no one really talks about.
Oh, the thing is, we've never been taught that I know of. When you have an engine failure, you always check mixture rich, they say, assuming you're coming down from altitude and you're too lean. Well, why did I go for that? I never heard of anybody doing or ever was
When
taught.
you said that, I was very baffled by the, excuse the pun there, baffled because it was baffling.
So 3 weeks later, I got a letter, and it was from a supporter back in, I think, Pennsylvania or something, about 12 hours difference, more or less. She says, I was waking up about that time in the morning with a real burden to pray for you. Did anything happen?
Who was this?
That's a supporter.
Okay, a supporter, yeah.
Woken up in the night, 12 hours difference about.
Yeah.
Which was the time zone.
Yeah.
When I was having that engine failure, she woke up to pray. That's why I did it. It wasn't because of me being smart.
I can't tell you how many stories like that. It's like the significance of the timing. That seems to be a consistent theme in a lot of stories I've heard regarding prayer. And there's one of those stories like that about when Jesus healed a centurion's servant, I think, and the timing matched.
Yeah.
And there's so many stories that missionaries tell when I talk to them. Prayer timing. There's something to that.
Oh, yeah. And that's why if you're going to be out there, serving the Lord wherever, it's good to have as much prayer support as you can.
Yes.
I mean, some people think they can't do anything for the Lord and all that, but you can sure pray for people.
Yeah.
And even ourselves, you get a burden to pray for somebody, just do it. Who knows what they may be going. You may never find out, but
yeah,
God uses that. My mom was dying at one time, and my dad tells the story, and all of a sudden she had a turn for the better and got better. Found out it was the same thing again, only the mail was so slow back then, and 6 months later got a letter about that somebody had prayed.
Wow. Wow. Okay, so tell us about why you transitioned to Bolivia, and let's talk about your time in Bolivia. And how long were you in Bolivia?
4.5 years.
4.5 years there. Okay.
So I came back from the Philippines and then went to A&P school. So I was back for 2 years then. School was, I went to Moody for their aviation.
When it was in Tennessee?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I did that. That was like an 11-month course, I think. It's an all-day thing instead of half day like regular.
Yeah.
So I did that and then had furlough, and then we started the program down there with a 206, and then went to Aztec. Mm-hmm. So we're based in Cochabamba, which is 8,500 feet, so we had to climb up over. Our lowest pass, if you just skim through on a clear day, was 13.5 to get to the jungle where we're going. And so you're always dealing with Cochabamba Valley weather, mountain weather, and jungle weather.
Yeah, so you had 3 systems that you had to figure out. Yeah.
Yeah, so had to learn to live with that.
Wow.
And then weren't supposed to fly single engine IFR down there. So anyway, having the twin helped take care of that. But also it turned out the Aztec was more efficient, cost per pound.
Really?
So I studied the matter quite a bit with different twins and all stuff and whatnot. And I narrowed it down to the Aztec or the Islander, which the Islander carried more, but it was slower than the Aztec, but the cost per pound was the same. Of course, the Islander cost more, but then the deciding factor in my mind was, well, if you have to make partial loads, like you're carrying some people out or whatever, and you're not filling it, then the Aztec was cheaper per trip.
Yeah.
So that's why we went with that.
Okay.
And it worked out. It was the closest flight that we had was the same cost per pound of the Aztec or the 206. The farther I went, the cheaper it was to fly the Aztec, believe it or not.
Yeah, and that's largely because it's just fast.
It's faster and carried a lot, considerably more.
Sure. Yeah,
Now,
that's really
some
interesting.
things have changed too. They ended up putting wing extensions on the 206 and a gross weight increase, I guess, and so that narrowed the difference a little bit, but. That airplane really worked out for us.
Yeah.
Plus, we flew over lots of inhospitable country, just like we do in Alaska here.
Yeah.
And my dad used to say that 75% of the jungle was flooded in the rainy season. And I always kind of wondered if Dad exaggerated a little bit. I'd check it out, find out he didn't. I flew over there, mile after mile, looking down there, seeing water glinting up between the trees.
Really?
I thought, man, if anything, it was more like 90%.
Wow.
So it's single engine over that stuff. I mean, people do it all the time, and God preserves them. But
yeah. So discuss that a little bit.
Nice having 2 engines.
Just for a few minutes, I want to hear your thoughts on single engine versus twin engine. Obviously, twin engine safer because you have that redundancy. But I was asking you, is there any single point failure that can cause both engines to fail? And it doesn't seem like it.
No, it would be quite unlikely unless you got water or something.
So water might be the only thing, but if you have a proper pre-flight and you're draining the fuel tanks, and And have you ever had engine failure, like one of your engines fail in the Aztec?
Oh, sure. I was flying for Cochrane Hills, and
that's here in Alaska.
Yeah. And I was having trouble with the tanks didn't seem to be feeding evenly.
Okay.
I always have a stick and I measure it when I add fuel and all that, because the fuel gauges are unreliable.
Yeah, we all know.
Yeah. So the issue ended up being a selector valve would leak through, so fuel would go from one tank to another.
Okay.
And so I didn't have as much fuel as I thought I had. So I was just going out of Cochrane Hills, not too far, heading for Nenana, and the left engine quit. And it just balked basically. And the instant the engine does anything, I hit crossfeed, and it came right back. And that tank had run dry because of that fuel leaking into another one. So that's another thing that I had happen on a Cessna 180 one time. I was flying it back from the Midwest and it had an extra tank in it. And I wanted to climb up high and get all the way to San Diego in the thing. So my foolproof method of seeing how far I could get on the fuel is I'd run a tank dry. I'd go back and forth and time them, and then one dry, so I'd know exactly how much I had, right? So I was running the fuel, and man, I'm doing really great. I was up at 10,000 and leaned way out. And, man, I should have plenty of fuel. So I stayed up high, and I was getting in toward the mountains, but now the fuel gauges, now this is a brand new airplane to me, so I'm not familiar with it. It's starting to get real close to empty, and I'm getting a little concerned. My tried and true technique here is telling me I got lots of fuel, but the gauges aren't agreeing.
I think I know what's happening, but go ahead.
So anyway, I kept it high, and I kept an eye on the airstrips back, and I got toward the mountains, and I was high enough I could get to Ramona if I needed to, because I was going to Gillespie Field there in San Diego. So anyway, come on down, I land, and I'm taxiing in, and the engine quits about 20 feet before the tie down.
Wow.
Well, my tried and true method was not working because that fuel selector was leaking. Not leaking out, but leaking from one side to the other.
Yes.
So as it leaked in, I kept getting fuel from the other tank, thinking, man, I'm really doing good here. So if you ever get a new airplane, make sure you test it that fuel selector is shutting off one side and the other.
That in the 180, it doesn't have a both option. It's either left or right.
I think it did have both.
But you just didn't run it that way.
No, because that way I can time my fuel.
Yeah, to have more accuracy and all that, yeah.
I don't like running both. Because if I run one dry, I know at least I got some in the other one. So anyway,
that's interesting.
So don't trust your fuel gauges or your fuel system until you've checked it out.
Yeah, I just installed a new engine monitor on a nice new digital one. And in the instructions, it says, do not rely on fuel levels for accuracy. Even though it's all digital and nice and modern, it tells you don't rely on this. So I still have a pad on my lap, and I track how much I expect to have versus what I'm reading. What I read confirms my math, but I still do the math.
Good for you.
Because it's just a good discipline, and it makes me more aware of what's going on. And you can't trust those things. Yeah.
No, and another thing about a twin is you've got redundant systems. So let's say a fuel pump went out. Well, on your 206 or Cherokee 6, you'd sit there till you got another one, right?
Yeah.
So what are you going to do? Well, Aztec, for one thing, you've got
in the Cherokee
more.
6, there is an auxiliary pump that I could run.
But would you want to fly back on that?
Only if I had to. If I didn't have to, I wouldn't go.
Exactly. And I mean, it'll get you where you're going, but now you've landed, okay. Now, do you want to trust that thing all the way back over hostile territory?
Right.
So you'd probably wait until you got apart, more likely.
Yeah.
Well, with a twin, you can cross-feed. However you run your tanks, you use the fuel more or less normally.
Yeah.
But it'll keep the engine running. So now you have an engine-driven pump driving both engines, or you've still got two electric pumps which will drive either or. So you've got four pumps for those two engines.
Can each one of those pumps run both engines?
Sure.
So you can, even if only one pump is working, you can still, you put on the crossfeed, one of the pumps, and you're good. It gives enough pressure to the system. Wow.
So that's an advantage.
It is.
Of a twin. So, plus all the stuff we fly over up here. I mean, like they're going out to Buckland and all that swampy lake stuff. And there's a lot of places not to land there.
We've got a lot of hours over that empty land. Yes. It was interesting, speaking of fuel pumps, because I was just working on the Cherokee 6, and the fuel pump switch wasn't working. So I bypassed the switch to see if the switch was the problem. Sure enough, it was a bad switch. And the switch worked most of the time, but every now and then, whatever the contacts inside the switch were worn out. And so it was intermittent. So it can trick you when you test it before you take off. It works, but then it can fail. But I noticed that on the ground in the hangar while, testing it. It's a good thing I noticed it. So that switch is replaced now. But it does go to show, just because you tested something, you still can expect the worst.
Oh, yeah, man, that'd be a disappointment, wouldn't it? running on you.
Especially on one of those Buckland runs, flying over that long tundra, long nothingness over there.
Oh, man. Well, I had an interesting thing happen here on a lake amphibian. I bought the thing real cheap, and I figured out why, because the engine was giving issues. But you'd fly along, and the engine pressure would start dropping, the fuel pressure.
Yeah.
And you turn on the electric pump, and it'd come back up, right? So it's got to be the engine-driven fuel pump, right?
You would think, yeah.
So we changed the engine-driven fuel pump, still got a problem. So now what are we going to do? Well, long story short, it was actually the electric fuel pump that was the problem.
Was it clogging up?
No. The check valve wasn't stopping the backflow. So your engine fuel pressure is going up and then back down through the fuel pump instead of stopping.
Yeah.
But you had to run the fuel pump to make the engine run.
Yeah.
But it was the problem.
Yeah.
So
it was it was a really difficult one to chase down.
That was a head scratcher.
Yeah, that is a head scratcher. Wow, that's interesting. I'm going to have to listen back on this episode for those insights later. That's interesting. All right, so tell us some stories from Bolivia. You had 4.5 years there. Tell us why you were flying there, who you were flying for. You mentioned the 13,500 was your lowest altitude through a certain passes.
Well, it was a dream come true to fly down there because I was raised down there, and I'd sit in the class in a boarding school and just dream of flying off that airstrip. I was telling you earlier about one of the pilots lent me his private pilot books.
Oh, yeah.
And I'd sit there in class and study that stuff and learn how to do the wind triangles and whatnot and navigation stuff. And then by the time I learned to fly, I never had to actually do that because now we had the hand calculator thing.
Yeah, the E6B.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Anyway, I learned how to do that.
Now we have iPads and fancy glass panels.
Yeah.
And
and then the maps were way off. They said they're like 30 degrees off. And I don't know how in the world they got them that far off down there, so they're practically useless. And Wycliffe made up a bunch of hand ones, so that helped some.
Yeah.
Basically, had to learn the country. And
wow.
in fact, when I left, a friend of mine says, "I'd like to buy the map that's in your head."
That's funny.
I started hearing about GPS while I was down there. And at that time, they said it would be something like the size of a transponder. And there was no thought of having moving map or anything. It just that long, and you could take you to it. Man, what a neat deal that would be down here. 'Cause a lot of times you're flying in weather, and you just head out a certain heading, fly a certain distance, and start letting down. And so one of the farthest places I went was on a little river, but it was kind of in the trees too, so you kind of had to look for it. But instead of just trying to go right straight to it, if the weather was down, I'd fly to the right of it so that when I found the river, I'd know to turn left. Otherwise, if you go straight to it and you're not seeing anything, now which way do I turn?
Yeah, it's under your nose, right?
Or you may be off one way or another.
Yeah.
So if I purposely fly off to the right, or more likely turn left to find it. And that always worked well.
Yeah, yeah. That's.
But I let down soon enough too that other landmarks of certain lakes or whatever would show up, and
yeah.
so that would help. But,
and over time, you start learning what to look for.
oh yeah, definitely. And there was, Bolivia had quite a few crashed airplanes out there. Some of those are landmarks. Neat planes that they overload them and lose an engine and they couldn't maintain, and so they wouldn't be lawn darted in. They just land in a swamp or something.
And were you there for the same reason as in the Philippines? You were servicing missionaries in remote places,
Right.
Did you do the same thing, like hike into a village for the preparation of a new airstrip? Was that something you did in Bolivia?
I'm trying to think. Oh yeah, opened up one airstrip in the mountains. Hiked in there, but there was actually a road up in there fairly close, so that wasn't too bad.
Okay, it wasn't like this extreme hike or anything.
No, and in a lot of those places you could get to by river. For instance, to give you another idea of what flying means to missions, it's not a luxury. It's the cheapest way to do it in a lot of cases. So when I was a kid, 15, my dad took me out to the jungle where they were trying to reach this tribe, and had made some attempts, and they'd made an airstrip in a grassland near there, near where they wanted to go. Yeah. But we wanted to go up, or the missionaries did, and I went along, to build an outpost upriver a ways and on the other side, on the side of the river that the Indians, they thought would be there. Mm-hmm. So after flying all day across country in a DC-3 up to where the missionary had a houseboat, because he worked with a different tribe. Mm. So then I don't know how many days it was to get ready for this trip. So we got in that boat, and then we dragged a big canoe with a smaller canoe on top of it. Mm. So we were going to leave the big canoe at the destination, and then I'll back up a little bit. So we had to go upriver so many days and then go up another smaller river. Well, the houseboat would only go up the big river. Yeah. So I had to leave that. We got into the other canoe with the one in it, and then went the rest of the way to our destination. And it was, logs in the river and trees, and you took a good supply of shear pins. You could always busting shear pins, hitting logs. So my job was to run the motor and change shear pins. Yeah. So anyway, and then once we got to a destination, then the guys from the launch then went back in the smaller canoe, and that took them back to pick up the launch and go back. Mm-hmm. So it took us 10 days. Wow. When I was there, when I was flying the Aztec, I'd go up there in 2 hours and 10 minutes.
10 days versus 2 hours.
Yeah.
Wow.
10 days plus the trip across town. So basically it saved you 2 weeks. Yeah,
that's amazing. That's just amazing.
I know.
So before we hit record, we were talking about some unique techniques that you've learned over the years. And the one we spent most of the time talking about was the impossible turn. Would you describe what the impossible turn is and what technique you have learned that's a little bit different than the impossible turn?
Well, they like to make the impossible turn seem impossible, and it is to a certain point. But my contention is when they explain how to do it and all that, they figure in the bank angle and the stall speed going up with the bank angle and so on, depending on how steep the turn is. Well, if you can actually turn the airplane around by just rolling it over into a vertical bank and then letting the nose fall through as you come around and pick it up at the bottom, and you lose the turn gets by very quickly and you lose a much less altitude. Mm-hmm. But it's something you just don't go out and do. You've got to practice it in whichever airplane you're in, and get an instructor you trust to deal with that. Mm-hmm. But like the Cub, I mean, maybe people can do it better than I can. But I was out playing with it the other day, and I could turn that thing around 180 degrees and lose 150 feet.
That's really amazing.
So we did it in the lake when I was teaching somebody, and that was 400 feet. So what you'd want to do is, know that, and then give yourself some buffer that you're comfortable with. Mm-hmm. And so when you take off, if you're below that number, let's say 500 feet. Mm-hmm. If you're below that, don't think of turning back. Go straight ahead or left or right or whatever. But whatever airplane you're flying regularly, go out and practice that so you know how high you can be to get that. Mm-hmm. And as long as you're unloading the wings, that stall speed doesn't go up. Yeah. If you're trying to make a turn, a vertical bank and hold it level, of course you're going to stall way high, spin in or something.
Yeah, because the wings are loaded.
Yeah. So if you unload the wings, it's not going to stall.
So it's a pretty fast maneuver. It goes pretty quick, doesn't it? Because you got to whip it around pretty fast.
Exactly.
But it's pretty aggressive too, and that's probably the part you got to get used to.
Technically, it's an aerobatic maneuver because you're past 60 degrees or whatever.
Yeah.
But anyway, you can practice at different bank angles, whatever you're comfortable with. Yeah. But then just so you know how much it takes to turn back. Mm-hmm. Another thing to think about is when you take off and say you've got a crosswind, maintain runway heading, let's say, if you need to, or anyway, drift downwind. So if you do have to turn back, now you're you don't have to turn around and then line up with center line.
Oh, interesting. I never thought of that.
Yeah.
So you let the wind take you.
Yeah.
And then if you have an engine out, you turn into the wind. It gives you more lift.
Well, even on the airlines, they say for takeoff, maintain runway heading.
Right.
They say heading.
That's what I've always been taught.
So you're drifting.
You crab into the wind to maintain it. That's what I've always been taught.
Not runway course, runway heading.
Yeah, and so
you are going to be drifting technically. I don't know if that's what they mean, but
but that's what happens when you maintain the heading.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So then you always keep in mind which way you're going to turn to get back to the runway.
And so when you're in your takeoff procedure, you're always thinking about that. When I pass 500 feet or whatever your number is for your plane, you've crossed that threshold. Your brain shifts. Now I know I can turn around. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, I like that one. And the other one we were talking about is using, if you're in a box canyon, for example, using the creeks or the rivers in the canyon. What's that trick?
Well, in the Philippines, the weather is crummy a lot, and down on the ridges, and so we always had our favorite passes that we'd go through to wherever we're going to our destination. So we'd have our favorite one, and then if that was clobbered, we'd go out with one or another. And sometimes there wasn't much room between the clouds and the slot in the hills there. So you'd come up just like most of us know up here. You come to a ridge at 45, not only just to test the wind, but also to get up close and see if you can see over the other side, and see because sometimes you can see the ridge, but the clouds are packed up against it, and you want to go into that because then in the soup right on the other side
You're
of the ridge.
in the soup and in a narrow place.
So we look and see if we can see, then turn around and then go across. And then once you get in there, look at the creek down there and see which way the water's running so you know which way is downhill. Because I found that when you're getting all turned around and you're looking for one pass and then the other one, you can get across there and think you should go one way and not the other. So that's just another thing to pay attention to. And, you're always going toward lower terrain then, of course, and going down the creek. You may not want to go that way, but at least you need to know.
At least you need to know.
Yeah.
Right. Well, Brian, we've been going for about an hour now. Unless there's any other stories, I think we can wrap it up. But, tell me about, to kind of conclude our time, tell me about just what you're up to now. What are your plans for the future? What's going on with you right now?
Well, been retired for quite a while. After I left Bolivia, about 3 years later, I got out of the airlines. Started out as a mechanic. When they started hiring quite a bit, got on as a pilot. So,
which airline did you fly for?
It was Republic Airlines, and then Northwest bought us. Okay. So that's what brought me to Alaska, actually. We had a freighter base up here.
Oh, okay.
And so I flew out of Anchorage. In fact, always was curious about Alaska, wanted to come up here. I mean, I wasn't a yearning for it, but what infected me with that one, when I was 9 years old, we were on furlough, and we were at the training camp, and the father of the director there was an old guy that had been in Alaska. And somebody says, you go over to his house on Saturday mornings, and he'll tell you stories about Alaska. Oh, Saturday mornings, another little guy and I went over there to listen to stories about Alaska. And it turned out, near as I can tell, he was up here in the gold rush.
Oh, wow.
So what's interesting is that me, alive today, knew somebody from the gold rush.
Yes.
But see, I was 9 and he was in his 80s.
Yeah. Oh, I love things like that. That's so interesting. Yeah.
So it shows how young our country is when you stop and think about it.
Yes.
I mean, while I've been alive, there's even been Civil War widows alive.
Wow. Yeah, I realized recently. Well, first I saw this little video the other day. It said if you're 80, I think it said if you're 81 years old. I think 81's the number. You have lived through 1/3 of the history of our country.
Isn't that something?
And then I realized also my grandfather, who I knew very well, I grew up with him around. When he was a young boy, he would have been around people who were in the Civil War, which is just mind-boggling to me. He could have just sat and chatted with someone who was in the Civil War.
Exactly.
Unbelievable how just we think like Abraham Lincoln is so long ago, but it's not.
Oh, no.
It's not. That is a weird thought. And before we hit record, we were chatting. You said What did you call Alaska? You called it like the nearest thing to paradise.
The doorstep of heaven.
Yeah. And so when you pass away, you don't have very far to go.
You're right.
I like that.
Oh, it's so privileged to live here and just tell you.
Oh yeah, and we're sitting in your home right now, looking out over a lake. We can see mountains in the background. It is stunning.
And the way the sky changes all the time. I always wanted to make an album of pictures from the deck, we call it, let's say. And it just changes all the time, and it's just so gorgeous.
Yes.
Especially when I first started coming up here and landing in these little lakes and flying around, it's just indescribably beautiful. The words don't aren't adequate.
Yeah.
And I've been in a lot of places in the world, and within 1 hour flight around right here is some of the most beautiful scenery in the world.
Yes.
And here we are, privileged to
just sitting in it. Yes, I try really hard. I take pictures with my phone. I have a GoPro camera, and these are really neat technologies to try to capture it, but there's nothing like just seeing it.
Oh, yeah.
There's nothing like it. Like the phones don't capture it, the GoPro doesn't capture it. It gives you some idea, but you gotta go up in the plane yourself.
No, that reminds me of, there was a little lake out there, one of my favorite places, right down toward the Kenai, is up in the mountains. And it's more like a river, a little skinny thing. Mm-hmm. Well, it's in a narrow place. Mm-hmm. And that's where a canyon turn comes in handy, too. So I'd come down, look at the lake, and basically a canyon turn like we're talking about. So roll that thing over and down. Mm-hmm. You make a turn in a tight place.
Yeah.
Doing that, you got to have the altitude to do it.
Right.
And, it works very good. And if you get going up a runway canyon, don't wait till you're at ground level to make your turn. But as long as you have a few hundred feet, you can get out of that narrow canyon you think you're stuck in.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
You got to cuddle up to one side of the rocks.
Yeah.
So you got the whole thing to turn in. Don't be trying to run up the middle.
Right.
And then you only have half of it.
Yeah, that's like Canyon Flying 101. Stay on the side.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
interesting.
interesting.
And that turn I'm talking about gets you around really tight.
Huh. It's so interesting because I've heard my whole aviation career about that, like the impossible turn. Usually we use like 800 or 1,000 feet just to go straight. But with that turn, you can reduce that way down. It's much safer.
Oh, yeah. But you got to get out and practice it so you're comfortable with it.
Yes. You have to be comfortable.
Yeah.
And confident. That's the thing about pilots is, I was talking about with someone the other day, pilots may appear to be cocky or confident or arrogant, but you need someone with that kind of confidence to do some of these maneuvers. So you need sort of that. You might call it cockiness, but I would just call it confidence, experience. I know I can do this. And
that's very important. Early on, when I got my instructor's rating, there's one thing I always try to do when I was working with somebody is give them confidence.
Yeah.
For instance, on the mission field, there were pilots that came from a certain organization, highly trained, but they didn't have confidence. And that handicapped them a certain amount. They couldn't live up to their full potential until they got that confidence and knowing what they could do and not be afraid of it. And when your training is regimented all the time, I think that kind of breeds that thing too. Well, I can't do it unless I'm told or whatever.
Yeah.
So that was an eye-opener. But you don't want to be reckless, but you also want to be confident that you can do what you know how to do.
Yeah. You don't want that false confidence where you can't do it, but you pretend like you can.
Yeah, no.
You don't want that either.
Exactly.
So, yeah. Interesting. Well, Brian, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm really excited to publish this one and share it with some friends. So I really appreciate you taking some time. Unless there's any other stories you want to throw out there, just want to say thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Brian. Okay, Brian, bonus story. Go ahead.
Well, when I grew up in a boarding school, all of my schooling, except for when we were on furlough.
Yeah.
So when I was 11, this cute girl came to school. It wasn't any of the ones I grew up with down there. And so I took a liking to her right away. I was 11 and she was 12. So anyway.
And this is down in Bolivia, right? Yeah.
Tambo was the boarding school. So anyway, we were boyfriend and girlfriend for most of the time that she was down there. She was only there for 3 years.
Okay.
And long story short, we lost each other. And didn't know if she was dead or alive. Son-in-law came up to help me with a project, got me into a computer and Facebook. I never even heard of what Facebook was. And lo and behold, you could find people. So I put out the word, does anybody know where Alberta?
And when is this?
This would have been in 2010. Somebody that knew her gave her my number.
Yeah.
So I was back in Wisconsin visiting my folks, and I'd been up all night with my dad in the hospital, and Christmas Eve. So Christmas morning, got in about 6 o'clock, I think at 9 o'clock, get this phone call. Hi, this is Alberta from 51 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
You remember me? Well, yeah. Long story short, I didn't, at that point, didn't know if she's dead or alive or where she lived or anything.
Neither
Wow,
one.
no contact. Wow.
Turned out she was an hour and a minute away in Anchorage.
And he was living
And I'm here.
Wow, and you knew each other at 10, 11 years old, whatever, in Bolivia.
He'd been up here 20 years. I'd been up here 40 years.
Okay.
When we connected.
Yeah.
We'd both been single for over 2 years.
Wow,
In
okay.
fact, we were both divorced
Yeah.
within 2 weeks of each other in the same courthouse in
Anchorage.
Anchorage.
Oh, wow.
So anyway, the last
Crazy country.
gift I gave her when she left when I was a kid, I was 14 and a half, was a set of bows and arrows that I'd gotten from some Indians. And I'd specifically picked out the arrow points I wanted, so I'd have a nice set with each arrow point
Yeah.
different.
And there they are. Your wife pointed out they're on your wall.
Yeah. And I've been
Wow.
always going to fix them and put feathers on, and the one tip is missing that I could make.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Yeah.
there they are. She kept
There
them
they
all
are on
those
your
years.
wall. Oh, what a great
My kids
tribute
grew
up
up
there.
playing with them, obviously.
Yeah. Oh,
It's
sure. Yeah. Cool story, Brian. I love that. Like it all came full circle.
That's something.
Yeah. And so, how long you been married now?
Yeah, coming up on 13 years.
13 years.
Hey.
Okay. Neat. Well, there we go.
It feels like it's been 60.
Yeah, it feels like 60.
That's what it should have been.
Yeah. There we go. Bonus story with Brian.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll throw that in there.
Oh, that broke my heart when she left.
Yeah.